The year was 1944, and the Allied forces were preparing for one of the most crucial phases of World War II. But hidden among the thousands of soldiers marching across Europe was a unit unlike any other in military history. They carried no real weapons, commanded no actual tanks, and yet they would become one of the most effective fighting forces of the entire war. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. A top-secret unit of 1,100 men whose weapon was not firepower but pure deception. Among their ranks were fashion designers from New York, painters from Paris, sound engineers from Hollywood, and architects from prestigious universities. These were not your typical soldiers. They were artists, and their canvas was the battlefield itself. The idea began in the mind of a few brilliant military strategists who understood something fundamental about warfare. War was not just about bullets and bombs. It was about perception, about making the enemy believe what you wanted them to believe. If you could convince the Germans that an entire division was in one location while your real forces attacked elsewhere, you could save thousands of lives. The unit was assembled in secrecy. Recruitment officers scoured art schools and advertising agencies across America looking for men with specific talents. They needed painters who could create realistic scenery under pressure, sound engineers who understood acoustics, set designers who could construct believable props from almost nothing, and radio operators clever enough to mimic the communication patterns of entire military divisions. Training began at Camp Forest in Tennessee. The men were sworn to absolute secrecy and taught both traditional military skills and theatrical techniques. They learned how to create shadows and highlights to make flat surfaces appear three-dimensional from the air, how to position inflatable equipment so reconnaissance photos would look authentic, and how to move and behave like a much larger force. The equipment they were given was revolutionary. Engineers had developed inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, and even entire airplanes made from rubber and canvas. Each inflatable tank weighed only about 70 pounds and could be carried by just 4 men. But from 200 feet in the air, German reconnaissance planes would see what appeared to be a 30-ton Sherman tank. The inflatables were incredibly detailed, with fake treads, painted shadows, and even dummy crew members positioned around them. But the visual deception was only part of the illusion. The Ghost Army also employed sonic deception on a scale never before attempted. Sound engineers had recorded actual tank movements, artillery fire, and the noise of troops building bridges. These recordings were then played through massive speakers mounted on half-tracks that could project sound up to 15 miles away. The speakers weighed 500 pounds each and could make a small group sound like an entire armored division on the move. The unit shipped out to Europe in May 1944, just weeks before D-Day. Their first major operation came during the Allied push across France. A real armored division needed to move from one sector to another, leaving a dangerous gap in the line. The Ghost Army was sent in to fill that gap, not with soldiers, but with illusion. They arrived at night and worked quickly. Inflatable tanks were positioned across the landscape, dummy artillery pieces were set up on hillsides, and sound trucks played recordings of tank engines and armored vehicles. But the visual and sonic elements were only the beginning. The men had to sell the deception through their behavior. They wore the patches of the division they were impersonating, drove vehicles with the markings of units that were supposedly in the area, and deliberately spoke in local cafes and bars, letting slip false information that they knew would reach German ears. The radio deception was perhaps the most sophisticated element. Operators learned to mimic the unique sending style of real radio operators from the units they were impersonating. Every radio operator has a distinctive rhythm when sending Morse code, like a fingerprint. The Ghost Army operators studied these patterns and could replicate them convincingly enough to fool German intelligence officers who had been tracking specific operators for months. One of their most daring operations came near the German border. A real infantry division needed to move south for a major offensive, but if the Germans discovered this movement, they could reinforce their positions and turn the battle into a slaughter. The Ghost Army was tasked with making the Germans believe the division was still in place. They set up hundreds of inflatable tanks across a 10-mile front under cover of darkness. Dummy trucks and jeeps were positioned along roads. Sound trucks played recordings of convoy movements throughout the night. Radio operators generated enough traffic to suggest multiple battalions coordinating defensive positions. The deception had to be perfect because German patrols were close enough to potentially discover the ruse. The artists in the unit worked through the night, using their skills in ways they never imagined when they studied at art school. They painted shadows on flat surfaces to create depth, used principles of perspective to make props appear correct from specific viewing angles, and understood how light would hit objects at different times of day. Every detail mattered, because one mistake could expose the entire operation and cost thousands of lives. During the day, the men maintained the illusion through their movements. They created dust clouds by dragging chains behind vehicles to simulate tank activity, moved the inflatable equipment periodically so aerial photographs would show the equipment in new positions, and even created fake tire tracks using special rollers that mimicked the tread patterns of actual military vehicles. The operation lasted for 5 days. German artillery occasionally fired at their positions, and the men had to maintain their composure while shells exploded around their rubber tanks. They couldn't return fire without revealing that they had no real weapons. Intelligence reports later confirmed that the Germans had kept multiple divisions in position, waiting for an attack from the Ghost Army's location, while the real American forces struck elsewhere with devastating effect. As the war progressed, the Ghost Army's operations became more ambitious. They began coordinating their deceptions with actual military operations, creating elaborate scenarios where their fake forces would appear to threaten one objective, while real forces attacked another. One operation involved creating the illusion of a massive buildup for an attack across the Rhine River, with hundreds of pieces of dummy equipment, constant recordings of construction sounds and radio traffic about engineering challenges, while the real crossing was being prepared miles away at a completely different location. The psychological aspect of their work was tremendous. These men knew that if their deception failed, real soldiers would die. Every inflatable tank they positioned, every sound recording they played, every fake radio message they sent could be the difference between success and disaster for actual combat units. Yet they couldn't talk about it with anyone outside their unit. Their operations during the Battle of the Bulge were particularly crucial. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive, Allied forces desperately needed time to regroup. The Ghost Army was rushed to multiple locations, creating the illusion of strong defensive positions where there were actually gaps in the line. Their deceptions bought precious time for real units to move into position. Their success rate was astonishing. Intelligence estimates later suggested that the Ghost Army conducted over 20 major deception operations. They successfully impersonated more than 10 different divisions at various times. German intelligence files captured after the war showed that their deceptions had been largely successful, tying down enemy forces and causing the Germans to make strategic decisions based on false information. When the war ended, the men of the Ghost Army faced a unique challenge. Their work remained classified, and they were ordered never to speak of it. They returned home to civilian life carrying the secret of what they had done. The artists went back to their studios, the sound engineers to their recording booths, but none of them could tell anyone how they had really spent the war. For decades, the Ghost Army remained one of World War II's best-kept secrets. The men kept their oath of silence even as they aged, and the war became history. It wasn't until the 1990s, nearly 50 years after the war ended, that their story began to emerge when documents were declassified, and the few remaining veterans finally felt able to speak about their experiences. The legacy of the Ghost Army extended far beyond their wartime operations. Their techniques influenced military deception doctrine for decades. The understanding that warfare involves perception as much as firepower became fundamental to military planning. Modern military deception operations still use principles developed by those artists and engineers who turned the battlefield into a stage. What made the Ghost Army truly remarkable was how they demonstrated that creativity and intelligence could be as powerful as conventional weapons. These men saved thousands of lives not through violence, but through art and ingenuity. They proved that sometimes the best way to win a battle is to convince the enemy that the battle is somewhere else entirely. The story of the Ghost Army reminds us that war is not just about the soldiers on the front lines or the generals making strategic decisions. It's also about the creative thinkers who find unconventional solutions to impossible problems. Their inflatable tanks never fired a round. Their dummy artillery never launched a shell. Their recordings played sounds of battles that never happened. Yet through these illusions they helped win a real war. The Ghost Army proved that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in what you have, but in what you can make others believe you have.